Okay, a different location. I'm in here. This is I had to kind of feel out of sorts in a different place, but you got to deal with it. We've got guests visiting, and because we have common sense, we have some social distancing things happening here in this house. So I'm in a new place. So some of my son's artwork, masterpiece. Um, so anyway, let's talk about American Empire in the late 19th century into the early 20th century. This is chapter 20 of our book. And then I'm going to have another lecture on the World War One stuff. So this is the Empire stuff, and the next one will be the World War One stuff. American Empire in this time period is unique. Look, you've taken other classes, AP World or Modern World, Patterns, whatever. Um, you've seen empires before, so that's nothing new. But what's new about American empire in the late 19th century is its empire plus capitalism, which is now like chef's kiss, right? It's making a lot of money. Not great for workers or the environment, but it is expanding rapidly. And part of that expansion is wanting to avoid overproduction. So you got to find new people to buy your stuff. Part of that rapid production, the pace of production, is technological advancement, right? So that's an element that, like, the Romans, wasn't really a thing for them. And then the last element is social Darwinism, that certain races, certain people, the United States, for example, white Americans, are, more evolved, more fit, whatever. So all of these elements come together to create the kind of empire that we see in this time period. I think I might skip the next slide here just for the sake of time. Um, Here you see a map. There's the United States, South America. I hate it when that thing pops up. Go away. Anyway, you have all of these islands here, right? So the Philippines, big acquisition, 1898, Spanish-American War. Puerto Rico, Cuba here, also Spanish-American War. But you see other islands that, Baker Island, 1857. What's that about? Midway, 1867. The United States started expanding out into the Pacific before the Civil War, largely due to what's the Guano Act, the Guano Islands Act, guano being like bird or bat um, poo. They found out that this is actually a great way to fix nitrogen in soil. So being largely agricultural, this was like fertilizer, right? It's the realization that you can use guano as fertilizer. So they go, they get all these crappy islands. All these crappy islands actually was any U.S. citizen. So any like it wasn't just the United States government. Any like U.S. citizen with a boat could go out, and if you saw some crappy island, you could claim it for the United States and then start mining guano. Anyway, all of these little islands are going to be important because just like if you're driving up to San Francisco on the 5, you got to stop and get gas every now and then. These are all potential places to stop and fuel up on your way to the big market over here, which is obviously China. And that's what a lot of American manufacturers want, is to sell their stuff in China. Um, we don't need to get into the cartoons too much. Just two different views of McKinley here. Him, like, as one speculates about something, right? Looking at the map of the Philippine archipelago, and it says civilization begins at home. Obviously, the figure of Colombia pulling back the curtain to expose, right, lynchings in the United States. So part of the argument for colonizing these far-flung places was civilizing them. And obviously the cartoonists here being quite critical of this idea of, civilization in the United States. I mean, it's a total barbarism in the South, what's happening. And then here we'll see a lot of these racist caricatures in cartoons from this time period. You have the Philippines here getting scrubbed in the cool waters of civilization. And then in the background, you got Cuba and I think maybe Guam or Puerto Rico putting on their American uh, pajamas. So this is part of the social Darwinism here, right? You see the social Darwinism that these people are in colonizing them. They're actually good for them. More examples. We can get into some of this stuff in class. Woodrow Wilson getting into trouble. And this is one that we'll talk about. This is The White Man's Burden, an image, again, racist caricatures of the British kind of conquests here, and then the new American conquests here. Cartoonists, both critical of American empire and pro-American empire, simply just tapped into the racist caricatures that they had of black Americans and just projected them onto Cubans, Filipinos, Guamanians, you name it. And that's exactly right what we see here, right? Climbing up to civilization at the top. We'll read The White Man's Burden in class. We don't have to, I'm not going to get into it now. Sadly, I've taught it enough where I have the thing basically memorized. So that's a not so fun fact. Okay, let's get into it. So the main takeaway, we don't want all this, don't we? Give you the whole shebang. The main takeaway here when looking at U.S. empire in the late 19th and early 20th century is understanding there's two different versions. One is the Asian and Pacific version. One is the Latin American, Caribbean version. And it's really important to know it's not just American empire is the same everywhere, right? It's very different depending on where it's happening. So in the Pacific, we have China. As I said, the technology, the capitalism, all of this feeds into American empire. The technology also producing the weapons that you can use to expand empire. Those weapons are then used to open new markets, which are places for manufacturing to sell their goods, all that kind of stuff. So this is the big, like, dream of American manufacturers. All these people in China, if we could just get them to buy our stuff, right? We would never, because there's two things you can do, right? When you're making too much stuff, it's like simple economics, right? You can reduce production, right? So that you can keep, because if you keep on making stuff and no one wants it, you're going to have to drop your prices, and they don't want to drop their prices. They don't want to reduce production. So they go with the other option, which is find new buyers for your stuff. And that is what they see as that's what China is going to be to American manufacturers. Never actually turns out to be the case, right? The Chinese market just doesn't want, right? Because it's not like American manufacturers are making stuff that Chinese people would like. Again, because of social Darwinism, the idea is like you need like a table that's like high up, like so you don't sit on the ground, and you need chairs, and you need to wear like a suit and a tie like we do, because clearly we are, right, more right evolved or whatever. So there's that social Darwinist, that kind of cultural arrogance that says, part of the civilizing project, let's convert them all to Christianity and have them all buy tables and chairs and suits and pocket watches and all the other stuff that's being made. Part of the deal here is that the United States, unlike other European powers, recognizes we don't need to be in China. We don't need to have boots on the ground, as it were, right? We don't need to, like Germany, like France, like Japan is doing. We just want you to buy our stuff. So we're not interested in setting up military bases. We just want you to buy our stuff. So we recognize your sovereignty. And that's a big advantage for China, right? That at least the United States isn't going to be also kind of marauding through their territory. Chinese, a lot of people, especially in southeastern China, a lot of people. I mean, when we look at China, you think it's like, oh, it's this huge country. It's like, this is not like, we don't need to worry about that. Like, that's not really a thing that really is super important in the time period. And it's still, to this day, not heavily populated. We're talking kind of like this part here and down, right? Lots of people. Taxes are high because they need to pay back. The Germans, this part of the Boxer Rebellion is a rebellion against high taxes that are being levied on poor people in order to pay back the Germans, because the Germans say you have to pay us because you killed some of our missionaries. So not a good look. The United States says we don't need to get involved. We just want you to buy our stuff. All of these are kind of showing up here. Okay, open door policy, talked about that. That's China, right? Spheres of influence. This is this notion that, again, the United States isn't going to mess around, not only just with China and Chinese sovereign territory, but we're not trying to get in a battle with Japan or France or whomever else, right? There's just too many cooks in the kitchen already. Um, we have the open door policy, spheres of influence. The Treaty of Portsmouth ends the Russo-Japanese War. Put a mental pin in this because this is kind of a big shocker, right? Again, all that social Darwinism stuff about Europeans being the best, and then suddenly Japan like beats Russia like really bad. And Japan also is saying, Japan's also tapping into social Darwinism. They're effectively claiming that they're like the white people of Asia. They're more, civilized and they need to civilize these other countries. They beat Russia. So it's, again, put a mental pin in this because we can draw a very clear line from what's happening here to what will happen in World War II, right? You can only have these two kind of imperial powers growing so big, the United States and Japan, before something pops off. Gentleman's agreement also has to do with Japan. It is the United States' xenophobia. They don't want any more immigrants at all. They especially don't want Asian immigrants. But again, the Japanese are claiming, well, we're not like other Asians. We're like the superior Asians. We're like Europeans. We're like the Europeans of Asia. We're colonizing and conquering all these other groups, and it would be pretty embarrassing for us to be treated the same way as any other kind of group. So here's the deal, they say, right? You don't block us. You don't block Japanese people from immigrating to your country, and we'll make sure that Japanese people can't go to your country, right? So the United States says, okay, fine. We just don't want the immigrants. We won't say anything about banning, like they've banned the Chinese Exclusion Act and the Asian barred zone where no one in Asia can immigrate. Japan's excluded, but Japan does their part to make sure that no one leaves. That's a gentleman's agreement. Root Takahira is basically recognizes that Japan is a sovereign power, and it recognizes Japan's claims in Manchuria. Korea is already like it's just part of Japan, so it's not even like a colony. It's just like it's Japan, right? And the Root Takahira agreement recognizes their claims also in Manchuria, or Manchukuo as they called it. Manchuria being, let me go back to a map here if you're not familiar, right? Like up here, right? So this is Japan as we now know it. This is Japan after 1910. There's Manchuria. We would get more into it if this was a world history class. They do a lot of bad stuff. Not like any empire, any imperial power, the United States included, right? United States, the Belgians, Japanese, you name it. A lot of bad Japanese do a lot of bad stuff in Asia. Okay, so back to the United States, you see this big Navy in the background. We have all of these policies. None of these policies here, Portsmouth Agreement, Gentleman's Agreement, Open Door Policy, these aren't belligerent laws. These aren't the United States saber rattling or threatening anyone, right? It's very, very diplomatic, but you got the big army, you got the big Navy. So that is when the Teddy Roosevelt, right, speak softly and carry a big stick. That's the big stick, right? So you can negotiate good terms when you have the big stick. Okay. So what does this have to do with the Philippines? Spanish-American War happens. The United States acquires the Philippines. The United States isn't particularly interested in selling stuff to the Filipinos. What the Philippines is a stepping stone to China. That's the word you see here in the cartoon. After all, the Philippines are only a stepping stone to China. That is the phrase, right? If you're going to remember, sorry, blocking this here. Put me back over here in the United States. If you're going to remember something about this, that's the thing to remember. Philippines are a stepping stone to China. This cartoon exemplifies it. Want the Chinese to buy all of this stuff. Trains, train cars, rail, watches, clothes, you name it, lamps, stoves, whatever. And the Philippines, right, being the kind of last stop on a kind of road trip that's been, in the process of being growing since before the Civil War. Okay, back to where we were here. Okay, so Spanish-American War is not a big deal. We get Cuba, Puerto Rico, and all that kind of stuff. The United States gets all those things. Um, Filipino-American War is a big deal. That it is more deadly than the Spanish-American War. It lasts longer than the Spanish-American War because the notion is if you're a Filipino, you've been fighting the Spanish for a long, long time, and you thought you were going to get your independence. And the United States has other plans. The Filipinos, who again have been fighting the Spanish for decades, led by Emilio Aguinaldo. He was kind of seen as the Filipino George Washington. He was the one he thought he was actually on the Olympia, the battleship Olympia, when the surrender of the Spanish is signed. Aguinaldo is there, like he thinks he's the right. He's been kind of tapped as the new leader. Turns out he's not. The Spanish had paid him to leave. I think they were going to pay him like I think it was something like three payments of $1 million, 1, 2, 3 million total. He got the first payment and they came back. It's like, yeah, 1 million's fine. I'm going to go back to fighting for independence. The United States, you see these casualties here from the long war. U.S. troops 4 to 6,000, Filipinos 16 to 20, 30 some thousand civilians. Hundreds of thousands die from disease. This is not a one-sided war simply because of superior firepower. This is a one-sided war because the United States was engaging in massive atrocities. And effectively what we would now call war crimes. This is widely reported. Remember the yellow journalism, the muckraking, all of that kind of journalistic tradition. So that is part of it. There are people publishing photos, huge piles of bones or dead bodies, firsthand accounts of soldiers and what they're doing. Really, really nasty, terrible, terrible stuff. So very, very deadly. It does not engender any kind of goodwill or favorable opinions from the Filipinos towards the United States. You have to remember, they basically, as I say here, they controlled the whole thing, right? The Spanish were basically just in Manila, and isolated missions around the Filipino archipelago. So this was seen as a really, obviously, a big step back for the Filipinos. Okay, that's Asia, right? Market. China's a big market. Avoid overproduction. Keep on making as much as you can. Find new people to buy the stuff. Got to have the Philippines as a kind of staging area for U.S. imperial expansion into China. Latin America, different thing. For the United States, Latin America is about producing literally, but what we would call banana republics. Banana Republic, I think they went out of business recently, but they're like, contemporarily like a cheap place to buy like, bad khakis or whatever. But the original Banana Republic, and this is also another irony after the riot at the Capitol. People were saying, "Oh, the United States looks like a banana republic. Looks like a banana republic." And the irony, of course, being that the United States is the place that set up these banana republics through imperial suasion throughout Latin America, and it was just that. It was places like Honduras that grew a lot of bananas. And a company like United Fruit wanted to encourage as much as possible that farmers were growing bananas. And the government was very favorable to that, right? So obviously, if you're a small independent farmer and you're trying to feed your family or you're trying to make money, you don't like that. And a lot of people in Central America were not very happy with these policies, but they're banana republics, right? The whole point of the country was to, right, banana, pineapple in Hawaii, coffee in other places. And again, think about the technology. Ships are faster. Refrigerated ships are just starting to come about. The rails, trains move faster. So suddenly, things like bananas, coffee, sugar, pineapple are all things that American consumers want because what they have more disposable income because they're working all these jobs, right? The middle class is growing. So this is what the United States is doing in Latin America through their policies. Remember, the policies in the Pacific are not belligerent towards Asia. The policies in Latin America are a little bit more um, uh, uh, belligerent. So Monroe Doctrine, this is something that we learned about in the 1820s. It's not really relevant in the 1820s. It basically says that the United States, from after the War of 1812, the United States is just kind of still getting its sea legs, not fully established, and they don't want to have European powers interfering in the Americas. So the Monroe Doctrine says, you can't come over here and mess around in the Americas. It'll be seen as an act of war. That's negative doctrine. Negative doctrine is a policy that says other countries can't do things, or anyone can't, right? So like, thou shalt not kill is also negative doctrine, right? Or like, or whatever, any number of laws of stuff you can't do. You can't like go 120 miles an hour on the freeway. That's negative doctrine. Can't do stuff. Monroe Doctrine had always been negative. The Roosevelt corollary, or the kind of remix of the Monroe Doctrine, flips it into a positive doctrine, saying we, the United States, can. We said you couldn't, but we didn't say anything about what we could do. So again, this opens up the Americas to colonization and other kinds of interference, right? Making sure that governments have policies that are friendly to the United States and American agricultural interests in particular. Tons of land. It's cheap. It's fertile. And as I said, this stuff can be shipped with these new technologies. And American consumers have more money. They want it. This is part of the reason why everywhere else in the English-speaking world, whether it's India or Pakistan or New Zealand or Scotland or Canada, they drink tea. Right? They drink tea everywhere. The United States drinks coffee. Part of the reason is this heavy investment of capital, investment of empire, and also investment of culture into all of these Caribbean products. One of the main ones being coffee. The United States does support many independence movements, as I'll show you in an upcoming slide. Panama, for example, was a restive or a rebellious region of Colombia, and the United States supported its independence. And the first thing it does is, right, sign the treaty for the Panama Canal. Keep in mind, right, that these policies, United Fruit in Honduras, the policies in Nicaragua, other Latin American nations that they're very favorable to American manufacturers. They're not really great if you're poor in these countries. If you're a farmer, if you're, an industrial worker, an urban worker, things like that. The government's is definitely going to listen more to the money and the military influence of the United States than they are a bunch of like poor farmers. Keep this in mind because when we learn about the Cold War, it's going to make things make sense, right? That like after farmers for a generation in Central America have been kept poor, forced to grow bananas, not make a lot of money, right? Someone suddenly hands them a AK. Well, I guess in 1945 it wouldn't be an AK-47, but from 1947 on, right? An AK-47 and a copy of Marx. And people go like, oh, yeah, like this makes a lot of sense. So a lot of the kind of Cold War proxy wars between the Soviet Union and the United States and Latin America are kind of the seeds have been planted, as it were, in this time period. Okay. Examples, right? Cuba has always been a target of American expansion, as I've mentioned in class. Dumb Southern enslavers had made the argument that it was an alluvial deposit of the Mississippi, right? Over thousands of years, all the dirt from the Mississippi builds up like a sandbar. That's Cuba. That's not true. Cuba is a source of, or the United States points it's jingoism. Jingoism is like aggressive nationalistic foreign policy, is aimed at Cuba. The sense of, again, cultural superiority, social Darwinism. After the Spanish-American War, 1898, the Teller Amendment is supposed to set Cuba up to be an independent nation. The Platt Amendment, not so much, right? Establishes Guantanamo Bay, which is still with us, and also effectively creates Cuba as a protectorate of the United States. Again, all that sugar, all that rum, all that tobacco, want to make sure it's cheap, want to make sure they're growing a lot of it. Again, keep this in mind when we learn about the Cuban Revolution, when you think, well, where did all this ill will come from? Kind of comes from that. Okay, insular cases. Insular like islands. So the Supreme Court hears a bunch of cases in this time period effectively saying, look, when Texas became part of the United States, the Constitution applied. When California became part of the United States, the Constitution applied. When Alaska became part of the United States, the Constitution followed the flag. So is that true for the Philippines now? Is that true for Guam, for Puerto Rico, for Cuba? And this is a debate, and it goes to the Supreme Court in the insular cases, all the different islands. And most famously, and I think it's really illustrative, is the decision in Downs versus Bidwell, 1901, regarding the status of Puerto Rico. Supreme Court says that Puerto Rico is domestic in the international sense, but international in the domestic sense. And if we were in class, I'd have you try to explain to me what that means, but we're not. So I'll explain it, right? Obviously, domestic in the international sense means like if it's other countries, Spain, England, France, who are interested in meddling in Puerto Rico, that's domestic. It's part of the United States, hands off, right? But when it comes to the perspective of people in Iowa or Kansas or Michigan or something, or California, Puerto Rico is foreign in the domestic sense. So that they don't have the same rights as American citizens. They can't travel freely to the United States. This changes, right? So Puerto Rico, right? The status of Puerto Rico has changed. But in this time period, right? Again, social Darwinism. The last thing the United States wants is a bunch of people, brown Catholics, effectively, right? That in a time period where being white and Protestant is the standard for social Darwinist understanding of civilization, this is not something you want to take on here. So that is the insular cases. A couple last brief slides here, and then we'll wrap it up before 30 minutes. Teddy Roosevelt, Big Stick. Roosevelt says that it's the United States' job to go, civilize these waste spaces, places where you're not using it right. Right. So who are the Colombians to say what we can and can't do? Well, it's their sovereign territory, but so what? Right. Social Darwinism. We need to go develop, right, for the greater good of society, and in particular American manufacturing, to build the canal, this, that, the other. And here's the example I gave you, right, about Panama being recognized. Taft, dollar diplomacy, book doesn't really get into it too much. But again, he sends troops in Nicaragua to create the banana wars, again, setting up these banana republics. The Bryan Chamorro Treaty makes Nicaragua a protectorate of the United States. That's not repealed until FDR. FDR has a more favorable foreign policy towards Latin America. Lodge Corollary, after Henry Cabot Lodge. You can just remember it as the Monroe Doctrine, right? Positive doctrine, shifted to the Pacific. Japan wants to buy parts of Baja California. Mexico says, sure, right? We're a sovereign nation. We can do what we want with our own territory. The United States says you actually can't. You can't actually sell your own territory to another country. We're going to say no. So that is the kind of example of the Lodge Corollary. American empire is what we remember about this time period, but not everyone, right? So just like any time period, people are dissenting, and a lot of people are not happy with America becoming an empire for various reasons, right? From like strict constitutional conservatives who say that this isn't allowed, the United States isn't allowed to do this, to the other side, right, leftist kind of socialists saying, right, this is imperialism, this is the exploitation of the working people in other countries, and it's working people in this country that are getting sent off to war, all that kind of stuff. Mark Twain writes a famous kind of essay called "To the Person Sitting in Darkness." It is a response to the Rudyard Kipling White Man's Burden poem, which we'll read in class. William Jennings Bryan, he's still doing his thing. He doesn't like it. And then Woodrow Wilson, once he is elected, he has a new foreign policy agenda, which is known as the New Freedom. It's more a moral argument, so less big stick, less empire, less military, less navy, more, well, let's make a moral argument for why you should sell us bananas or whatever. Again, why is that moral argument compelling? To kind of go back here, right? It's compelling for this reason, right? You can make a moral argument pretty persuasively when you have a enormous military to back up the endeavor. So again, that's American empire, late 19th, early 20th century, imperialism plus capitalism plus technology plus social Darwinism all coming together to make a unique kind of thing, right, in that particular historical moment, in that particular historical place, the United States, and then its imperial, um, uh, its colonies.